The folder was torn at the corner. Marcus Webb had meant to replace it a dozen times over the years and never had, mostly because a torn folder felt honest in a way a new one wouldn't have. He sat across from Bianca Reyes in a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of the Harrow building, wearing his one good button-down shirt, the folder resting on his knee, waiting for the interview to actually begin. Bianca had spent the first 4 minutes scrolling his resume on her tablet without looking up, occasionally tapping something into a note, her expression unreadable behind a practiced professional calm. "There's a 2-year gap here," she said finally, still not quite meeting his eyes. "Between your last operations role and now. Can you walk me through that?" "My wife was sick," Marcus said. "I stepped back to care for her, and for our son, until she passed. I've been consulting part-time since, mostly property management for a few small landlords, while raising him alone." Bianca nodded, the kind of nod that acknowledged the words without absorbing the weight behind them. She glanced down at his resume again, then back up, and something in her posture straightened. The way people straighten when they've decided a conversation needs to move faster than it's been moving. "I appreciate you sharing that," she said. "I do have to be direct with you, though, because I think you'd rather hear it now than after wasting more of your time." "Go ahead," Marcus said. "This role is client-facing," Bianca said. "Operations director isn't just spreadsheets. You're in the room when we pitch 6-figure retainers to executives who expect a certain," she paused, choosing the word carefully, though not carefully enough, "polish. Frankly, Mr. Webb, I don't think your presentation matches what this position requires. You're too poor for this job. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because our clients notice things like a 2-year-old blazer, and I'd rather be honest with you now than let you walk into a pitch meeting and get judged by someone far less kind than me." The words landed and sat in the room for a moment, plain and unmistakable, the kind of sentence that doesn't need repeating to be remembered. Marcus didn't flinch. He'd been underestimated in enough rooms over the years to know exactly how much energy flinching cost, and exactly how little it ever accomplished. He looked down at the torn folder on his knee, then back up at her. "I understand," he said, and closed the folder gently, the corner catching briefly on the edge of the conference table before he smoothed it flat. "I do hope you find something that's a better fit," Bianca added, already glancing toward the door, the interview clearly over in her mind several sentences before it ended in his. She stood, extended her hand, some small mercy in how the moment closed, at least, and walked him to the elevator herself, filling the short distance with polite, forgettable small talk about the weather that neither of them would remember by the end of the day. The elevator doors closed. Marcus rode down 14 floors in silence, watching the numbers count backward, replaying the sentence once, only once, before deciding not to give it any more room in his head than it had already taken. He walked out through the open floor of Solstice Digital on his way to the lobby, past rows of young employees in expensive, casual clothes, the kind of studded effortlessly that costs more than it looks like it costs, none of them looking up as he passed. A young man near the elevator bank was laughing loudly at something on his phone. A woman balancing a tray of coffee cups nearly collided with him and offered a distracted apology without slowing down. Outside, on the sidewalk, Marcus stood for a moment looking up at the Harrow building. 12 stories of tinted glass and brushed steel, a building he knew better than almost anyone walking past it, though none of them would have guessed why. He hadn't needed the operations director job. He'd applied because he believed, the way he'd believed since he first started Webb Holdings out of a 1-bedroom apartment 9 years earlier, that staying close to the ground floor of ordinary struggle kept a person honest. He interviewed for jobs like this one every few months, quietly, under his own name, never mentioning the small but growing portfolio of buildings he owned across the city. It reminded him what it still felt like to be dismissed. It reminded him, more importantly, why he never wanted his own tenants to feel the way Bianca Reyes had just made him feel in under 9 minutes. He walked 2 blocks to where he'd parked, an older sedan, paid off years ago, the kind of car nobody glanced twice at, and sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine, letting the morning settle into something he could carry without it weighing on the rest of the day. His phone buzzed. His real estate attorney, Diane Alvarado, calling about an unrelated matter that suddenly felt very related. "Marcus, it's Diane. Any update needed on your end for the Harrow deal, or are we still on track?" Marcus looked back up at the building. At the 14th floor he couldn't quite pick out from street level but knew exactly where it's Saturday. Still on track, he said. Where do things stand? The Trust's board is meeting this week to vote on our offer, Diane said. I'd expect an answer within the next few days. If it goes the way I think it will, you're looking at closing in about 3 weeks. Good, Marcus said. Keep me posted. He hung up, pulled out of the parking space, and drove home to pick up Eli from school, the sentence from the interview finally beginning to lose its sharp edges, replaced by something quieter and more patient. The particular calm of a man who already knew, better than almost anyone else in the city that morning, exactly how this story was likely to end. That evening, Eli was waiting at the kitchen table with a math worksheet and a peanut butter sandwich cut into careful triangles, the way he always cut it himself now that he was old enough to insist on doing it his own way. How'd the interview go? Eli asked, not looking up from his multiplication tables. Marcus set the torn folder on the counter, next to the empty coin jar that had sat there for 9 years, ever since the last coin from it had gone toward the down payment on his very first building. Didn't get it, Marcus said. Why not? Marcus considered how honest to be. He'd made a habit, since Rachel died, of never lying to his son about hard things, only choosing carefully how much detail a 9-year-old actually needed to carry. The woman interviewing me decided I didn't look successful enough for the job, he said, before she really knew anything else about me. Eli frowned, the particular frown he reserved for things that struck him as obviously unfair. That's not fair. You know more about buildings than anybody. I do, Marcus agreed, allowing himself a small, tired smile. But she didn't know that. And I didn't tell her. Why not? Marcus sat down across from his son, thinking about how to answer that honestly. Because I wanted to see who she was when she thought it didn't matter. That tells you more about a person than who they are once they find out it does. Eli nodded slowly, filing that away the way he filed away most of his father's harder lessons, not fully understood yet, but held on to for later, the way kids hold on to things they sense are important long before they can explain why. Did you find out? He asked. I think I did, Marcus said, glancing toward the empty coin jar on the counter. I think I'm about to find out a lot more, actually. Sooner than she expects. To understand why Marcus Webb could sit through an insult like that without flinching, you had to understand what he'd already survived to get there. He grew up in a 2-bedroom rental with his mother and 2 younger sisters, the kind of childhood where the landlord's name meant more to daily life than almost anyone else's, because a landlord who cared meant heat that worked in winter, and a landlord who didn't meant learning to layer blankets instead and pretend the cold was an adventure so his sisters wouldn't be scared. Marcus decided at 14, watching his mother cry quietly in the kitchen after another rent increase notice, that he wanted to understand buildings the way other kids understood sports statistics. Not because he loved them, but because understanding them felt like the only kind of power available to someone like him. He got his first job at 16, sweeping the hallways of a small apartment complex 2 blocks from home in exchange for a few dollars an hour and free tutoring in basic maintenance from the building's aging superintendent, a patient man named Otis who taught him how to read a water meter, patch drywall, and negotiate politely but firmly with contractors who tried to overcharge a kid who clearly didn't know better yet, until, slowly, he did. He met Rachel at 22, working the front desk of a property management office where he'd taken his first real full-time job. She was finishing her nursing degree, warm in a way that made even difficult tenants feel heard, and she was the one who suggested, half joking over a shared lunch break, that he start a coin jar, every spare dollar from every paycheck, saved toward something that mattered, instead of spent on things that didn't. The jar sat on their kitchen counter for 6 years. Coins first, then small bills, then, eventually, enough for a down payment on a rundown 4-unit building in a neighborhood nobody else wanted to invest in. Marcus fixed it up himself on nights and weekends, learned plumbing and drywall repair from library books and patient contractors willing to teach him in exchange for cheap labor, and rented the units to families exactly like the one he'd grown up in, at rates he set deliberately below market, because he remembered too clearly what an unaffordable rent increase actually cost a family trying to hold itself together. Webb Holdings grew slowly after that, one careful acquisition at a time, funded not by outside investors but by Marcus's own relentless frugality and Rachel's steady income as a nurse. By the time Eli was born, they owned 6 small buildings. By the time Rachel got sick, they owned 11, and Marcus had finally allowed himself to believe the coin jar years were behind them. The diagnosis came fast and cruel, an aggressive cancer that gave them 14 months instead of years. Marcus stepped back from active management during that time, hired a small team to keep the properties running, and spent every day he could by Rachel's side instead of behind a desk, learning to hold a different kind of ledger. Hospital schedules, medication times, the small increments by which a person you love slips away no matter how carefully you count them. She died on a Sunday morning in early spring, holding his hand, with Eli, 5 years old at the time, asleep in the chair beside the bed. Marcus buried his wife, raised his son alone, and slowly returned to the work that had always felt less like ambition and more like a promise he'd made to a 14-year-old version of himself who'd watched his mother cry over a rent notice. Nobody under my roof will ever feel that unsafe again. He never talked about any of it in interviews. He never needed to. The torn resume folder and the modest button-down shirt weren't a costume. They were simply who he still was, underneath the buildings he now quietly owned. At home that evening, after the math worksheet was finished and put away, Eli pulled out a folded piece of paper he'd been hiding under his placemat. "I made you something," he said, sliding it across the table. "For the coin jar." Marcus unfolded it, a crayon drawing of the empty jar on the counter, except in Eli's version, it was full again, coins spilling out over the top, with a stick figure labeled Dad standing proudly beside it, a wide crayon smile drawn carefully onto his face. "I know it's empty now," Eli said. "But I figured someday it'll be full again. For something else important." Marcus looked at the drawing for a long moment, thinking about the interview that morning, thinking about how strange it was that his son's instinct, fill the jar again, for something that matters, landed on exactly the same day Diane had called about the Harrow building offer. "You might be right about that," Marcus said, pinning the drawing to the fridge, right where the last one had hung before it eventually came down to make room for a new one. "Sooner than you think, actually." Eli grinned, satisfied, and went back to organizing his backpack for the next day, humming something tuneless under his breath the way he did when he was content, unaware that his father was sitting quietly at the table, thinking about a coin jar and a torn folder and how both of them were about to matter more than either of them yet realized. The following Monday, 3 weeks after the interview, Marcus's attorney called with the news he'd been expecting. "The board voted yesterday," Diane said. "They accepted our offer on the Harrow building. Closing is set for 3 weeks from Thursday, assuming the usual due diligence doesn't turn up anything unexpected." "It won't," Marcus said. "I've been watching that building's numbers for over a year. Let's move forward." He hung up the phone and sat for a moment at his kitchen table, the coin jar within arm's reach, thinking about the 14th floor of a building he now, in principle, owned, and about a torn resume folder that had somehow found its way into the middle of a much bigger story than a single rejected job application. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt something quieter and more complicated, the particular ache of knowing a reckoning was coming for someone who had no idea it was already underway, and the equally quiet hope that when it arrived, it might actually change something in her instead of simply humbling her for a moment before life moved on. The closing on the Harrow building took place on a grey Thursday morning in a downtown law office, a room full of attorneys and paperwork that Marcus had grown accustomed to over the years but never entirely comfortable with. He signed where Diane indicated, initialed where the notary pointed, and by 11:14 a.m., Webb Holdings officially owned 12 stories of tinted glass and brushed steel in the heart of the city. "Congratulations," Diane said, sliding the final copy of the deed across the table. "This is your largest acquisition to date, by a fair margin." "It doesn't feel that different from the first one," Marcus admitted. "Just bigger numbers." "That's usually how you know you're doing it for the right reasons," Diane said. He drove straight from the law office to the building itself, parking in the same modest sedan he'd parked in 3 weeks earlier, and rode the elevator to the top floor to meet with the property management team he'd be transitioning in. He didn't stop by the 14th floor. He had no reason to yet, and he wasn't in any hurry to force a reckoning before it arrived naturally. The tenant notification letters went out that Friday, drafted by Marcus's property management team in the same plain, respectful tone he insisted on for every ownership transition. No corporate jargon, no threatening undertones about lease compliance, just a clear explanation of what had changed and a promise of a building-wide meeting within 30 days to answer any questions in person. The letter landed on Bianca Reyes's desk along with 24 other pieces of mail that Monday morning, and she read it the way she read most administrative notices. Quickly, without much attention, filing it under building management, handle later in the part of her brain reserved for things that weren't quarterly revenue or client retention. Webb Holdings. The name meant nothing to her. She had no reason yet to connect it to a torn folder and a 2-year employment gap. She had a pitch meeting in 20 minutes with a potential new client, a mid-sized retail chain considering Solstice Digital for their next marketing campaign, and she spent the walk to the elevator running through her opening lines instead of thinking about a building ownership transfer that, as far as she knew, changed nothing about her day. The pitch went well. It always did, lately. Bianca had built a reputation over 5 years for exactly the kind of polished, confident presentation she'd once told a job candidate his torn folder could never deliver. She left the meeting with a verbal commitment and a follow-up scheduled for the following week, feeling, for a few hours at least, like the version of herself she'd worked so hard to become. 3 weeks passed quietly for Marcus, ordinary mornings getting Eli ready for school, ordinary evenings reviewing property reports at the kitchen table after his son was asleep, the torn resume folder still sitting, unused, in a drawer he hadn't opened since the interview. He didn't rush the reveal. He'd learned, over years of running Webb Holdings quietly and without fanfare, that the truth had a way of arriving exactly when it needed to, without anyone forcing it. He simply let his property management team handle the standard transition processes, inspections, lease reviews, introductory correspondence, the same way he handled every new acquisition, whether or not one of the tenants inside it happened to be the CEO who'd once told him, in under 9 minutes, exactly how little she thought he was worth. He did, however, personally review the full tenant roster before the walkthrough began, the way he always did with a new building, reading through lease terms and company profiles floor by floor. When he reached the 14th floor listing, Solstice Digital, 5-year lease, signed under founder and CEO Bianca Reyes, he sat with it for a long moment, feeling something more complicated than satisfaction, something closer to a held breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He thought about mentioning it to Diane, or to his property manager, some acknowledgement of the coincidence that felt too large to simply file away silently. He decided against it. This wasn't a story he wanted anyone managing on his behalf. Whatever happened next, he wanted it to happen exactly the way everything else in his life had. Plainly, honestly, without performance. The building-wide tenant meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the closing, in the Harrow Building's ground floor conference space. Attendance wasn't mandatory, but most tenant representatives came anyway, curious about their new landlord and what changes, if any, were coming. Bianca RSVP'd almost as an afterthought, delegating the task at first to her office manager before deciding, at the last minute, that as CEO she should probably attend building meetings herself, especially ones involving a new ownership group she knew almost nothing about. She marked it on her calendar between a client call and a budget review, giving it roughly the same mental weight as a fire drill, necessary, procedural, forgettable. She had no idea, walking into that conference room 3 days later, that she was about to see the torn folder again, and the man who'd carried it. The ground floor conference room filled slowly that Thursday afternoon with representatives from each company leasing space in the Harrow Building. Office managers, a few junior executives, and Bianca Reyes, arriving 11 minutes late, phone still in hand, scrolling emails as she found a seat near the back. She looked up when the meeting began, expecting a property management firm's regional director, the kind of interchangeable corporate face that usually ran these things. Instead, Marcus Webb walked to the front of the room in the same modest button-down shirt he'd worn to her interview 3 weeks earlier, carrying a newer folder tucked under one arm, not the torn one, though Bianca wouldn't have recognized either at first glance from the back of the room. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus said. "I'm Marcus Webb, founder of Webb Holdings. We closed on the Harrow Building 3 weeks ago, and I wanted to meet everyone in person before we made any changes, rather than sending memos and letting you learn about your new landlord secondhand." Bianca's stomach dropped, slowly, the recognition arriving in pieces before it fully landed. The voice first, then the careful, unhurried way he spoke, then, finally, unmistakably, his face across the room. She sat frozen in her seat as he continued, his voice steady, his manner exactly as calm as it had been across the conference table 3 weeks earlier, when she was the one holding the power in the room. "I want to be direct about something," Marcus said. "I know change in ownership makes people nervous, especially in commercial real estate, where the wrong owner can mean rent hikes, forced renovations, or eviction pressure disguised as lease renewal terms. That's not how I run buildings. I'll be doing a full walkthrough of every floor over the coming weeks, meeting with each tenant individually, and I promise you'll hear directly from me, not a form letter, about any changes affecting your lease." A murmur of cautious relief moved through the room. Most commercial tenants had lived through exactly the kind of ownership transition Marcus was describing avoiding, and the plain, unhurried honesty of his tone did more to settle the room than any glossy welcome packet could have. Bianca barely heard the rest of it. She sat through the remaining 20 minutes of the meeting in a kind of stunned half-attention, replaying the interview in her head, "You're too poor for this job," against the man now standing at the front of the room as her new landlord, describing, unprompted, exactly the kind of fair, transparent building management that stood in silent contrast to everything she'd assumed about him 3 weeks earlier. When the meeting ended and the room began to empty, she stayed seated, unsure whether to approach him or simply leave and hope, unreasonably, that he hadn't recognized her either. He had, of course. He found her before she found a reason to leave. "Ms. Reyes," Marcus said, stopping beside her chair. "I believe we've met." "Mr. Webb," Bianca said, her voice tighter than she intended. I had no idea you were the new owner. If I'd known, I would have." "Would have what?" Marcus asked, not unkindly, but not letting her off easily either. "Interviewed me differently. Said something different in that room 3 weeks ago." Bianca had no good answer for that, and they both seemed to know it. "I owe you an apology," she said finally, forcing the words out before she could talk herself out of it. "What I said to you was wrong. It was cruel, dressed up as honesty, and I've thought about it more than once since that interview, even before I knew any of this." Marcus studied her for a long moment. "I appreciate you saying that," he said. "I'll tell you honestly, I wasn't planning to bring it up today. This meeting was about the building, not about that interview. But since you've raised it, I want you to know something. I've been interviewing for jobs like that one, under my own name, for years. Not because I need them. Because it reminds me what it feels like to be judged by people who've never had to wonder whether the lights would stay on." Bianca absorbed that slowly, the full weight of it landing harder than the initial shock of recognizing him. "So this was some kind of test," she said. "For me specifically." "No," Marcus said. "It genuinely wasn't about you, until it suddenly was. But I'll admit, once Webb Holdings' offer on this building got accepted, I did wonder how you'd handle finding out. I think I have my answer now." He gathered his folder and turned to leave, pausing only briefly at the door. "The walkthrough of your floor is scheduled for 2 weeks from now," he added, without any particular edge to his voice. "I'll see you then, if you're around." That evening, Bianca sat alone in her office long after the rest of Solstice Digital had gone home, staring at her lease agreement, a document she'd delegated to her operations team years ago and never personally read in full. She read it now, cover to cover, understanding for the first time exactly how much power a landlord could hold over a company like hers. Rent escalation clauses, renewal terms, the quiet leverage built into every commercial lease that most tenants never thought about until the day their landlord decided to use it. She thought about the interview. "You're too poor for this job." She thought about how easily, without even noticing herself doing it, she'd used the exact same instinct that had built her entire career, the instinct to judge quickly, project confidence, never let anyone see uncertainty, and turned it into something that cost a good man 9 minutes of his life and, she suspected, considerably more of his dignity than she'd bothered to consider at the time. Her phone buzzed. A text from her office manager. "Everyone's talking about the tenant meeting. Someone recognized him from your interview a few weeks back. Words getting around fast. Bianca closed her eyes, feeling something she hadn't felt in longer than she could admit. Not the sharp panic of a business crisis, but the slower, harder discomfort of watching her own reflection in a mirror she'd been avoiding for years. Bianca didn't sleep well that night. Around 1 a.m., unable to settle her mind, she opened her laptop and searched Webb holdings online, the same way she might have researched any new landlord, except this search kept turning up small, unremarkable details that told a much bigger story than she'd expected. Modest rent increases, capped well below market rate, across every Webb Holdings property she could find records for. A tenant testimonial, buried in an old local news comment section, thanking a landlord who'd personally shown up during a flooding emergency at 2 in the morning to help residents move their belongings to dry ground. A brief mention, in a small local newspaper's coverage of affordable housing preservation, of a man named Marcus Webb who'd apparently turned down a lucrative offer to sell one of his buildings to a developer planning luxury condos, choosing instead to keep rents stable for the families already living there. None of it was flashy. None of it read like a press release. It read, instead, like a decade of quiet, consistent choices that had simply never been designed to be noticed. She closed her laptop without finding what she'd half hoped to find. Some easy reason to believe the interview had been a fluke, an aberration, not a real reflection of who she actually was. She didn't find it, because it wasn't there to find. The next morning, Bianca arrived at the office earlier than usual, dressed the same as always but moving with a different weight, the way someone moves when they're carrying a decision they haven't fully made yet. She found Marcus on the 4th floor 2 days later, ahead of his scheduled walkthrough, walking the building's shared common areas with his property manager, discussing a plan to repair a persistent leak in the parking structure that 3 previous ownership groups had patched over instead of properly fixing. Mr. Webb. He turned. Ms. Reyes. You're a bit early for the 14th floor. I'd like to request a different kind of meeting, she said. Not about the lease. About me. About what I said, and what I want to do to actually make it right, if that's something you're willing to hear. Marcus considered her for a moment, the same unhurried patience he'd shown in the tenant meeting the week before. I have 20 minutes now, if you'd like to walk with me, he said. I find conversations go better outside a boardroom, most of the time. They walked the building's basement level together, past the maintenance rooms and utility corridors most tenants never saw, Marcus pointing out infrastructure details as they went, not performing expertise, simply narrating the reality of a building he clearly understood inside and out. I read our lease in full last night, Bianca said. Cover to cover, for the first time since I signed it. I understood, properly, for the first time, how much leverage you have over my company right now. And I want to be honest. Some part of me spent half the night waiting for the rent increase notice, assuming that's what this was building toward. It's not, Marcus said simply. I don't run buildings that way. Never have. I believe that now, Bianca said. But I want to ask you something honestly. If you did want to punish me for that interview, you'd have every legal right to make my company's lease very difficult. Why haven't you? Marcus stopped walking for a moment, considering the question with the same care he gave everything. Because punishing you would prove exactly what you assumed about people like me, he said. That the poor, once given power, use it exactly the same way the wealthy always have, to make someone else feel small. I've spent my whole life trying to be the landlord I wished my mother had, back when a rent increase notice could make her cry at the kitchen table. That doesn't change because the tenant on the other side of it happens to be someone who once judged me unfairly. Bianca was quiet for a long moment, absorbing that. I want to do something, she said finally. Not because you're asking me to. Because I think I need to, for my own sake as much as anyone else's. I want to personally review every hiring decision my company has made in the last year, not just yours, all of them, and I want to understand how many other people I might have judged the same way I judged you, without ever finding out I was wrong. Marcus studied her for a long moment. That's a harder thing to do than an apology, he said. Apologies cost a sentence. What you're describing costs actual time, and it might tell you things about yourself you don't want to know. I think that's exactly why I need to do it, Bianca said. They reached the end of the basement corridor, where a service door opened back out toward the lobby. "I'll hold you to that," Marcus said, not unkindly. "Not because I expect you to fail. Because I think you'll need someone to, at some point over the next few weeks, when it gets uncomfortable enough that quitting starts looking easier than finishing." Bianca nodded, understanding, more than she wanted to admit, exactly how accurate that prediction was likely to be. Over the following 2 weeks, Bianca did something she'd never done in 5 years of running Solstice Digital. She personally reviewed every rejected candidate file from the past 12 months, reading notes she'd delegated to hiring managers, looking specifically for patterns she suspected, uncomfortably, that she might find. She found them. A qualified accountant rejected for not fitting the brand image after wearing an outdated suit to an interview. A talented junior designer passed over because her resume listed a community college instead of a 4-year university. A project manager candidate, a single mother, it turned out, reading between the lines of the interviewer's notes, quietly marked down for limited availability, despite scoring higher in every technical category than the candidate who'd been hired in her place. None of it was illegal. All of it was the kind of quiet, compounding bias that never showed up on a company's public values page, the kind that had, apparently, been running underneath Solstice Digital's hiring process for years without Bianca ever once looking closely enough to notice. She brought her findings to her head of HR, a woman named Priyanka Shah who'd flagged concerns about hiring inconsistency more than once over the years, concerns that had, Bianca realized with a fresh wave of discomfort, gone largely unaddressed. "I should have listened to you 2 years ago," Bianca told her, sliding a folder of her own findings across the desk. "When you first raised this." "I appreciate you saying that," Priyanka said carefully, flipping through the pages. "What changed?" Bianca considered how honest to be. "I got a very uncomfortable lesson in what it feels like to be on the other side of exactly this kind of judgment," she said. "I'd rather not need another one." Priyanka studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "If you're serious about fixing this, it's going to take more than a review. It's going to mean changing how every hiring manager in this building is trained, and probably losing a few who don't want to change." "Then let's start there," Bianca said. Marcus, meanwhile, continued his quiet walkthrough of the Harrow building, floor by floor, meeting each tenant individually the way he'd promised. He didn't single out Solstice Digital for special attention, and he didn't avoid it either. He simply treated Bianca's company the same way he treated every other tenant, with the same patient, thorough attention to what the building actually needed. That consistency, more than anything Bianca could have predicted, was what finally convinced her the apology she owed him wasn't really about the interview at all. "Can I ask you something?" she said, catching him on the 14th floor during his scheduled walkthrough, near the end of his inspection of Solstice Digital's space. "That day in the interview, did any part of you consider telling me who you really were? Just to see what I'd do differently?" "I thought about it," Marcus admitted. "For about a second. But I've learned something over the years, watching how people treat contractors, servers, anyone they assume has no power over their lives. The person you are in that moment, before you know it matters, that's usually the truest version of who you actually are. I wanted to see that version of you honestly, not a performance for someone you thought might matter." "And what you saw," Bianca said, "was someone who decided, in under 9 minutes, that a torn folder and a 2-year employment gap told her everything she needed to know." "Yes," Marcus said, without cruelty, simply stating what had happened. "But I've also watched, over the last 2 weeks, someone willing to actually sit with that discomfort instead of running from it. That matters more than most people think it does." Bianca spent the following week rebuilding Solstice Digital's hiring process from the ground up alongside Priyanka. Blind resume screening for the first interview round, standardized evaluation criteria for every candidate regardless of background, and mandatory bias training for every hiring manager, herself included. The rollout wasn't smooth. 2 department heads pushed back hard, arguing the new process would slow down hiring during a critical growth quarter. One senior account director, frustrated by the added steps, quietly complained to colleagues that Bianca was overcorrecting for one bad headline. Bianca heard about the comment secondhand and called the director into her office directly instead of letting it pass. "I understand the frustration," she said. "But I want to be clear about something. This isn't about a headline. This is about the fact that I nearly filtered out a qualified accountant for wearing an out-of-date suit, and a talented single mother for having caregiving responsibilities I never bothered to ask about honestly. If that makes hiring take an extra week, I think that's a fair trade. The director didn't fully agree, not right away, but the pushback quieted after that, replaced gradually by something closer to grudging respect as the new process began producing measurably stronger hires within a matter of months. The crisis that would truly test Bianca's growth arrived 6 weeks later, and it had nothing to do with Marcus Webb directly. It started with an email from Solstice Digital's largest client, a national retail chain that represented nearly a third of the agency's annual revenue, threatening to terminate their contract over a campaign rollout that had gone badly wrong. A scheduling error, compounded by a junior account manager's decision to hide the mistake instead of escalating it, that had resulted in the client's biggest holiday campaign launching 4 days late, missing the exact weekend it had been designed around. Bianca read the email standing in her kitchen at 6 a.m., coffee forgotten on the counter, her stomach dropping the way it had the day she recognized Marcus Webb's face at the front of the tenant meeting. She called an emergency meeting for 7:30, and by the time her leadership team assembled, the full picture had emerged. The junior account manager, a 24-year-old named Devon who'd been with the company less than a year, had noticed the scheduling conflict 3 weeks earlier, panicked, and quietly tried to fix it himself instead of telling anyone. A decision that had turned a manageable delay into a catastrophic one. "He should be fired today," said the head of client services, not unreasonably. "This could cost us the account entirely." Bianca sat with that for a moment, thinking not about Devon's mistake, but about the pattern underneath it, a company culture, she realized with growing discomfort, where junior employees had learned, somewhere along the way, that admitting a mistake early was more dangerous than hiding it and hoping it resolved itself. "I want to talk to Devon myself, before anyone makes a decision," she said. Not to protect him from consequences. To understand exactly what made him think hiding this was safer than telling someone. She found her answer in less than 10 minutes. Devon, visibly terrified, admitted that 6 months earlier, another junior employee had been quietly let go, officially for performance, though everyone on the team understood it had really been for reporting a client complaint that made the account lead look bad. The lesson everyone on Devon's team had absorbed, without anyone ever saying it directly, was simple. Mistakes that stayed hidden were survivable. Mistakes that got reported ended careers. Bianca sat with that revelation, feeling the full weight of exactly the kind of culture she'd built without ever intending to. One where fear, not honesty, decided how problems got handled. She called the client herself that afternoon, not delegating the difficult conversation the way she might have 6 weeks earlier. "I'm not going to make excuses," she told the client's operations director directly. "A member of my team made an error, panicked, and hid it instead of escalating, and the reason he made that choice is a culture problem inside my company that I'm only now fully seeing clearly. I take full responsibility for that, not him." "That's an unusually direct answer," the client said, after a pause. "Most agencies would blame the employee and offer us a discount." "I'd rather fix what's actually broken," Bianca said. "I'm prepared to run the corrected campaign at our cost, immediately, and I'd like to walk you through exactly what changes I'm making internally so this specific failure, an employee too afraid to admit a mistake, never happens again." The client agreed, cautiously, to a 30-day trial period before making a final decision on the contract's future. That evening, Bianca called Marcus, something she'd never initiated outside of a scheduled building matter. "Can I ask you something?" she said, once he picked up, "about something completely unrelated to the building." "Go ahead." "I almost fired someone today for a mistake that was really my fault," she said. "Not legally. Culturally. He hid a problem because he'd learned, somewhere in my company, that honesty gets punished faster than failure does. I fixed the immediate crisis, but I don't know how to fix the deeper thing. I don't know how to build a place where people feel safe enough to tell me the truth before it becomes a catastrophe." Marcus was quiet for a moment on the line. "Can I tell you something about my own buildings?" he said. "Every single one I own has a direct line, my personal cell number, posted in every maintenance office, given to every tenant. Not because I want to be bothered at midnight about a broken pipe. Because the fastest way to build trust is to make it obvious, structurally, that bad news reaches you quickly and safely. If people believe reporting a problem gets them punished, they'll hide problems until they're disasters. If they believe it gets them heard, they'll tell you the moment something goes wrong, when it's still small enough to fix. That's simple, Bianca said. Almost too simple. Most of the important things are, Marcus said. The hard part isn't understanding it. It's actually building a place where people believe it's true, day after day, especially on the days it would be easier to punish someone instead. The next morning, Bianca held an unscheduled all-hands meeting, announced a new direct escalation line to her personally, and stood in front of nearly 80 employees to explain exactly why it existed, a decision that would matter far more than she yet understood. 2 months after the Harrow building closing, Marcus invited Bianca to his office. Not the glass tower downtown, but a modest, unremarkable building in the same working-class neighborhood where Webb Holdings had purchased its very first 4-unit property nearly a decade earlier. "I wanted you to see this before we talked about anything else," he said, leading her through the ground floor. "This was my first building. I still keep an office here, even though most of my work happens elsewhere now." The office was small, functional, nothing like the polished conference room she was used to. A single shelf held a dusty, empty glass coin jar, a framed photograph of a woman Bianca assumed was his late wife, and a child's crayon drawing of a full jar spilling coins, pinned carefully beside it. "That jar funded this building," Marcus said, following her gaze. 6 years of spare change and small bills, saved on a kitchen counter, before I ever owned a single door. "Why show me this?" Bianca asked. "Because I think you've spent the last 2 months trying to fix a mistake by proving you're capable of humility in a boardroom," Marcus said. "That matters. But I wanted you to understand where the standard actually came from. Not some corporate values statement, but a woman crying over a rent notice, and a 14-year-old who promised himself nobody under his roof would ever feel that way again. I don't think you can really understand why the interview hurt the way it did until you understand what it costs, structurally, to be dismissed by someone who's never once wondered if the lights would stay on." Bianca sat with that for a long moment, looking at the framed photograph, the dusty jar, the child's drawing. "I want to ask you something honestly," she said. "Do you think I've actually changed? Or do you think I've just gotten better at performing change? The way I got good at performing confidence when I first became CEO at 26. Marcus considered the question with the same careful honesty he brought to everything. "I think that's a question only time can really answer," he said. "But I'll tell you what I've watched over 2 months. You read a lease cover to cover instead of delegating it. You reviewed a year of hiring files most CEOs would never bother looking at. You took full responsibility for a client crisis in front of your own team, in a room where blaming a junior employee would have been easier. Those aren't performances. Performances are easy and they don't cost anything. Everything I've watched you do has cost you something real." Bianca was quiet for a long moment, absorbing that. "I have a proposal," she said finally. "Not about the lease. About something else. I want Solstice Digital to run a paid internship and hiring program specifically for people my old hiring process would have overlooked. Career changers, caregivers coming back to work after a gap, people without traditional 4-year degrees. I want to build it properly, with real mentorship, not just a diversity headline. And I'd like your help designing it, if you're willing, because I think you understand something about second chances that I'm still learning." Marcus studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, not quite a smile, but close to it. "I'd be glad to help with that," he said. "On one condition. You run it because it's right, not because it makes a good story for your next investor pitch. The moment it becomes about optics instead of people, it'll stop working, and everyone involved will feel it." "I understand," Bianca said. "I mean it." "I believe you," Marcus said, and for the first time since the interview 2 months earlier, he meant it without reservation. They spent the next hour sketching out the framework of the program together: mentorship pairings, real salaries instead of unpaid internships, a hiring rubric designed specifically to catch exactly the kind of candidate Solstice Digital's old process had been quietly filtering out for years. The program launched 2 months later, modest at first: 6 positions, real salaries, real mentorship, but it grew a reputation quickly across the industry, not because Solstice Digital publicized it heavily, but because the people it hired turned out to be some of the most loyal, hard-working employees the company had ever had. One of the first hires was a woman named Corinne, a former accountant who'd left the workforce for 4 years to care for her aging mother. Exactly the kind of candidate Bianca's old hiring process would have quietly filtered out for a gap nobody had bothered to understand. 6 months into her new role, Corinne found Bianca in the break room and thanked her directly, not for the job itself, but for the interview that had come with it, the first one in 4 years where nobody had made her feel like her caregiving years were a liability instead of proof of exactly the kind of steady, reliable person she actually was. Bianca thought, standing there, about a torn resume folder and 9 unkind minutes in a glass conference room, and understood, more clearly than any spreadsheet could have taught her, exactly how far the ripple of one honest correction could travel once someone finally let it. 6 months after the Harrow building closing, Marcus held a building-wide tenant appreciation event in the ground floor lobby. String lights, a modest catering spread, and an open invitation to every company leasing space in the building, along with the maintenance and cleaning staff who kept it running, all treated, deliberately, as equally important guests. Bianca arrived early, and found herself, near the end of the evening, asked by Marcus's property manager if she'd be willing to say a few words. An ask that clearly hadn't come from Marcus himself, who was standing quietly near the back of the room, unaware it was coming. She hadn't prepared anything, but she walked to the small podium anyway. "Most of you know me as the CEO of Solstice Digital," she began. "What most of you probably don't know is that 6 months ago, I interviewed the man who now owns this entire building, and I told him, to his face, that he was too poor for a job at my company." A ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the crowd. Near the back, Marcus went very still. "I said it because I'd built my entire identity, since becoming CEO at 26, around never looking uncertain, never looking anything less than polished and successful, because I was terrified of being dismissed as too young to be taken seriously," Bianca continued. "And somewhere in that fear, I turned around and did to someone else exactly what I was so afraid of having done to me. I judged a torn resume folder and a 2-year gap without ever asking what was behind either one." She looked toward the back of the room, finding Marcus's eyes across the crowd. "What I learned afterward is that the gap in his resume was 2 years spent caring for his dying wife and raising his son alone. What I learned is that the lack of polish I criticized was a man who'd built an entire company, quietly, one modest building at a time, starting from a coin jar on his kitchen counter, because he'd promised himself as a teenager that nobody under his roof would ever feel as unsafe as his own mother once did over a rent increase notice." The room was silent now, fully attentive. "He didn't punish me for what I said," Bianca continued. "He had every right to. Instead, he let me sit with the discomfort of my own mistake long enough to actually change something real, not just my hiring practices, though those changed too, but the way I think about who deserves the benefit of the doubt in the first place. I wanted to say this publicly, in front of all of you, because I think the story people are already whispering about deserves to be told accurately, by the person who actually got it wrong. Not softened. Not spun. Just true." The applause that followed wasn't loud in the way a celebration is loud. It moved through the room the way real, earned respect usually does, quiet at first, then gathering, dozens of tenant representatives and building staff clapping not for a victory, but for an honesty they rarely got to witness from someone in Bianca's position. Marcus made his way through the crowd toward her once the room began to settle. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "I know," Bianca said. "I wanted to. I think I've spent 6 months trying to prove the change was real through actions instead of words, and I think there's a version of humility that stays private and safe, and a version that actually costs something because people are watching. I wanted to choose the second one, finally, on purpose." Marcus nodded slowly, something warmer than she'd seen from him yet crossing his face. "For what it's worth," he said, "the internship program has already changed more lives than either of us probably realizes yet. Corinne's not the only one. I've heard from 3 other companies in this building asking how they could build something similar." "That wasn't the plan," Bianca admitted. "But I'm glad it's happening anyway." Near the edge of the gathering, a maintenance worker named Ruben Alvarez, Someone Bianca had walked past in the building's hallways probably 100 times without ever learning his name, approached them both. "I just wanted to say," Ruben said, a little nervous, "I've worked in a lot of buildings over the years. Most owners, you never even see them, let alone hear them say something like that in front of everybody. Whatever happened between you two, I don't know the details, but it's clear something real happened. That matters to people like me, more than you'd probably guess." Bianca looked at him, really looked at him, the way she was still learning to look at people whose names she'd never bothered to learn before. "Thank you for saying that, Ruben," she said. "I mean it." Marcus watched the exchange quietly, recognizing in it something he hadn't fully expected 6 months earlier. Standing in a glass conference room across from a woman who'd looked at a torn folder and decided, in under 9 minutes, that she already knew everything worth knowing about the man carrying it. He'd been wrong about how that story would end. He found, standing in the lobby that evening, that he didn't mind being wrong about that at all. A year after the interview, Marcus's office in the old 4-unit building held one new addition on its modest shelf, the torn resume folder, no longer carried to interviews, framed now beside the empty coin jar and Eli's drawing of coins spilling out over the top. Bianca visited occasionally by then, not as a tenant meeting with her landlord, but as something closer to a colleague, sometimes even a friend, the two of them having built, slowly and without either fully planning it, a genuine working respect for each other's instincts. "The internship program's expanding," she told him, sitting across from his modest desk on a quiet Thursday afternoon. "We're up to 18 positions now, across 3 departments. Corinne's leading the accounting team's onboarding for it. She's better at identifying good candidates than anyone we've ever had in HR, probably because she knows exactly what it feels like to almost get filtered out for the wrong reasons." "That's not a coincidence," Marcus said. "People who've been underestimated usually make the best judges of who's being underestimated next." Bianca nodded, glancing toward the framed folder on his shelf. "Can I ask you something? Why keep it? You could have thrown it away years ago, long before any of this happened." Marcus considered the question, the way he considered most things, slowly, honestly, without reaching for an easier answer than the true one. "Because it reminds me what the folder actually is," he said. "Not a symbol of failure. A record of every room I walked into without knowing whether I'd be dismissed or heard. Most of the time, over the years, I was dismissed. That folder held up anyway. I think that's worth remembering, especially now that I'm the one deciding, every day, whether the next person walking into a room gets dismissed or heard." "And the jar?" "The jar's for Eli, eventually," Marcus said. "Not the coins, those are long gone. The idea of it. That something small and unglamorous, saved patiently enough, for a long enough time, for a good enough reason, can build something that actually matters. I want him to understand that before he understands anything else about what our family has now." That evening, at home, Eli was sprawled on the living room floor with a new drawing, more detailed than the ones from a year earlier, careful in a way that showed how much his hand had grown steadier over the months. "What's this one?" Marcus asked, sitting down beside him. "It's the building," Eli said, pointing to a tall rectangle covered in careful little windows. "The tall one downtown. And that's you." He pointed to a small figure at the base of the building. "And that's the coin jar." A small circle near the figure's feet, drawn full, coins spilling generously over the top. "Why'd you draw it full again?" Marcus asked. "Because it worked," Eli said simply, as though the logic were obvious. "You filled it once. Then you filled it again, with something bigger. I figured that's just what it does now. It fills up." Marcus looked at his son for a long moment, thinking about a torn folder and a 9-minute interview, about a coin jar that had funded an entire life he'd built one careful, unglamorous choice at a time, about a woman who'd once looked at both and decided they told her everything she needed to know. "Yeah," he said quietly, pulling Eli into a hug. "I think you might be right about that." Somewhere across the city, in a small accounting office on the 3rd floor of a building most people walked past without a second thought, Corinne sat at her desk reviewing a stack of resumes for Solstice Digital's next internship cohort. Resumes with gaps, resumes without 4-year degrees, resumes that a year earlier might have been filtered out before anyone bothered to read past the first line. She read each one carefully, the way she wished someone had read hers, looking past the gaps for the story underneath them, understanding, in a way she never fully had before her own difficult years caring for her mother, that a resume was never really the whole truth of a person, only the outline of it, waiting for someone patient enough to fill in the rest. She never met Marcus Webb in person. She didn't need to. The lesson had already reached her, the way real change always travels, not through the headline moment itself, the interview or the reveal or the building-wide apology, but through everything a person quietly chooses to become in the months after being shown, honestly and without cruelty, exactly what they'd almost failed to see. Back at the old 4-unit building, the framed folder stayed on its shelf, catching the late afternoon light through a window Marcus had fixed himself, years before he owned anything grander. A small, torn, ordinary thing, holding, in the end, more truth about who he was than any glass tower ever would.